We have Ms. Bev Harris, and Ms. Harris, we have the hearing has allotted you about 60 minutes for your testimony because you have had such a breadth of experience with the electronic voting and the problems in that arena. And so what you're about to tell us the truth, the full truth, and only the truth as far as you know it?
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. Please state your name and a little bit about your credentials for us today.
My name is Bev Harris. I'm the founder of Black Box Voting, Inc., which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3 consumer protection group for elections. I've been a writer and an investigative writer for about 2.5 years. I've been focusing on the elections industry. I got started on that when the first story I looked at was to determine who it was that actually owned the companies that produced the secret code that runs our elections. And I found that it was Senator Chuck Hagel. And at the time that I found, for the company ES&S, when I found that out, he was actually running for office at the time on the machines that he had ownership in and had been the owner of the company, and he had not disclosed it on his ethics documents, and it had never been reported by the mainstream press. That subsequently, of course, has been picked up in the mainstream press. The next thing I did was look and see if I could find any evidence that the machines were counting wrong. Now we have, we have a lot of evidence of that now, but at the time, no one had ever put together a compendium of miscounted elections on electronic machines. Within one day's work, I was able to assemble 56 elections that had been miscounted by electronic voting. They were pretty shocking. Things like the state of Alabama, the governor's race was flipped from one candidate to another in the middle of the night. It was on an election systems and software system, and the only explanation given by anyone was by the vendor, who said, "We don't exactly have the intelligence to say what happened." You're talking about flipping the governor's race, and they can't tell you what happened, only it happened in the middle of the night on a voting machine made by election systems and software. As I continued to look into the problems, I wanted to try to go through this horrible learning curve that the American people are expected to do if we're going to actually use any kind of computerized voting. I decided to try to figure out how machines work. I'm not a computer programmer, but I went looking, and actually, I'll be honest, I said a prayer right beforehand. I said, "I don't know why you've put me into this project. Whatever you want to happen, make it happen." Later, I ran across 40,000 secret voting machine program files from Diebold Election Systems, downloaded them. One of the files was called Rob Georgia. There had been some anomalous results in Georgia. The file contained instructions to replace the Georgia voting system with a separate set of files. And is this on? Okay. It's off and on. Yeah, you're going to give me a clip now. Okay. Oh, you're doing that? Okay. Okay. After finding these program files and downloading them, the first thing I did was hook up with a guy who had built touchscreen systems for a company called Vote Here. His name is Dan Spillane. At the time, he worked with me as a protected source because in this country, it's against the law, or can be considered against the law, to actually look at the programs that count our own votes. Dan Spillane quickly identified the Okay. Is it working again? Yeah. Dan Spillane quickly identified the source code tree for Diebold Election Systems touchscreens and optical scans. And over the course of the next few months, I had it looked at privately by protected sources On June 16, 2003, I had become convinced that the problems in the computer program were significant enough that we needed to make the code public. I took a risk. I released the files into the wild on June 16, 2003, and over the next 48 hours, it became clear that there were stunning security flaws. Less than a month later, the New York Times ran a story based on a study by Avi Rubin and 3 other, Dan Wallach, 4 researchers. The title of the story was Stunning Security Flaws Found in Diebold Election Systems. That was using the code that I had found on the web and released. But then an interesting thing happened. Over the course of the next couple years, I found a lot of information which has not made it into the press. For example, I have copies of the Department of Corrections documents for the chief programmer who handled every part of the Diebold system, and he had been in prison for 4 years on 23 counts of computer fraud and embezzlement. After getting out of prison, his name is Jeffrey Dean, he was on the board of directors for the predecessor to Diebold called Global Election Systems. He was made the senior programmer. He handled programming for touchscreens, optical scans, and every other component in the system, including a new program which you're going to be seeing, which is top secret right now, but Diebold is producing a program for absentee voting called Vote Remote. Has some very troublesome aspects of that particular computer program, which removes the human from the verification process of the absentee ballots. But what is most interesting at this point in time today is that although I released the files which give the architecture of the system, no computer scientist from the United States was courageous enough to tell us what is really in there. In May this year, I brought a, hello? Keeps going out. Okay, in May this year, in May 2005, I brought a computer programmer over from Finland. And this is the first computer programmer who has told me the truth about what is in those files. It took him 24 hours to find the architectural flaw. It's not subtle, and it calls into question the entire certification. Thank you. Here you go. Sounds good. Can you hear? Okay. What we have found through and I think the country of the United States of America owes Harri Hursti, the Finnish computer scientist, a debt of gratitude. In fact, we intend to write to the political leaders of Finland to thank them on behalf of the United States, because he's the first person who stepped up to the plate to tell us what's really inside Diebold. And what's really inside the Diebold system calls into question the very foundation of the electronic voting industry itself, including optical scan machines. Now, this is an evidentiary hearing. What the evidence will show is that computerized voting systems made by Diebold, and I think we'll need to look at the other manufacturers very shortly, but the computerized systems made by Diebold are open for business. Now, in Ohio, there was evidence of vote suppression and hiding public records and breaking election laws. But you can see that stuff. When you have vote suppression, you can see it. Diebold is going to be the vendor for the state of Ohio, and you won't see a thing. Black box voting decided, instead of focusing on Ohio after the election, we made a decision that was very strongly criticized.
There's a switch on that microphone with the wire on your left.
This one.
Yeah, there's on the top of the microphone.
Oh.
Switch that.
Get those others in.
There you go. I would just grab the
just someone tell me what to do and I'll do it. I've got 3.
Take it off. Take it off.
This one. Just take it and, okay. Let's get these guys out of the way. It's a trip.
Wireless connections.
When our organization decided to study what happened in Florida instead of in the state of Ohio, we were ripped to pieces. We were roundly criticized. People said they wanted a quick fix. Well, I have suspected that the fix has been in for a long time. I don't want a quick fix. I want a real corrective solution, and that means we've got to go straight to the root of this thing. We're going to be going toward a new generation of optical scan and touchscreen voting systems, including the new touchscreens with a paper trail. I wanted to find out how you go about, with real evidence, not theory, not speculation, not statistics, but with real evidence, how you go about manipulating the modern generation of electronic voting machines. Florida is one of the states in the US that actually all of the counties have left the punch card system and the lever system and the old systems and are using either optical scan or touch screens. Florida also has a stellar history of vote manipulation. And so we felt that that was a good place to begin to gather evidence. We started, however, by issuing a Freedom of Information request for the internal logs of the computer voting systems nationwide in 3,000 counties. We knew that we weren't going to get 3,000 counties. It would have cost millions of dollars to do that. But by issuing the Freedom of Information request, the public records law, it prevented them from destroying some of the records so that we could then go in a targeted basis and they could not say, oh, we threw that away, we didn't know anyone would want it. Less than 1% of the county governments that received a formal public records request complied. Almost none of them complied within the very brief time frames that are needed to actually audit an election in such a way as to change a race. But we did learn some very important things. When we started in Florida, the first place we went was Volusia County. And the reason we chose Volusia County is because it's probably the best evidence of real electronic voting fraud in the year 2000. In the year 2000, ostensibly due to a memory card problem, in Volusia County, Florida, Al Gore got negative 16,000 votes. That negative 16,022 votes is, according to a CBS News report about how they managed to accidentally call the election for George Bush in the middle of the night, and then they had to retract that. The call for George Bush was made because of the negative 16,000 votes in Volusia County, which happened to be exactly the margin needed in order to call the race. They did not retract the call until the president of CBS News ascertained that Al Gore was indeed not going to concede. It appeared to be a strong arm tactic to get Al Gore to issue a concession nationwide, and then, they could sort it all out later. But Volusia County, we know it's a fact. It's been widely reported. It's been corrected. They did a hand count after it, but they came up within the middle of the night at a strategic time, minus 16,022 votes for Al Gore. And I obtained internal memos from Diebold programmers in September of 2003. In these memos, the programmers are asked how they can go about explaining to an auditor the negative 16,000 votes. They conclude the votes are due to a replacement of an electronic memory card. A memory card is the size of a credit card, and it is the ballot box. So what we have nowadays are credit card sized ballot box, and in Volusia County in 2000, someone replaced the ballot box with a fake ballot box. The machines are not supposed to be allowed to accept such things. In fact, according to the 1990 Federal Election Commission standards, which were used to certify that rendition of machines used in Volusia County, it requires something called a checksum. It's
It's very much like it sounds. It's a sum that checks to make sure the data has integrity. Those checksums we found are not used on Diebold election systems in their optical scans. How did they get certified? This is not a gray area. This is black and white. They're either used or they're not. They're either required or they're not. They are required, they're not being used. So this is why we started in Volusia County. What we found in Volusia County was more evidence of memory card manipulation. The evidence of a memory card manipulation comes up in what's called a poll tape. It's a report that comes out of the optical scanner, the touch screen, at the polling place. And it contains the results of the election. One of the things we asked for in our public records request was a copy of all trouble slips, all problems they'd had, all the poll tapes signed by the poll workers, and a variety of other computer logs. What we found in Volusia County when they gave us the poll tapes was that they were dated November 10th. Of course, the election was November 2nd. None of them were signed. So I went back and insisted that they give me copies of the signed poll tapes, which were run on November 2nd on election night. They said they weren't at the elections office. And so when I asked them where they were, they said, well, they're kept at the warehouse, but we're near the end of business day. You can't go there till tomorrow. I asked what time the warehouse opened. They said 8:30. But told me not to go there. So our other investigator, Kathleen Wynn, and I showed up at the warehouse half an hour early at 8 a.m. with a video camera. We walked into the warehouse. We saw the election officials sitting at a table with poll tapes and pens. They shoved us out the door, and this videotape, by the way, is on our website now. As I was shoved out the door, I looked in a black garbage bag that was on the porch of the warehouse. Now, by the way, this warehouse is not listed anywhere in the public records. We had to call the fire department to find out where it was. It was in a swampy, woodsy area behind a chain link fence. So it was a little intimidating for a taxpayer to go there. But I found a black garbage bag on the warehouse steps. Looked in it, and inside it were poll tapes. In other words, the tape that comes from the optical scan machine, which is produced by the memory card. Had a little tug of war. I ended up writing a public records request, probably the first ever, for the contents of a garbage bag. Obtained the contents. Ultimately, what we found in Volusia County were two things that were very interesting. Now, Volusia County uses a Diebold optical scan system, meaning it has paper ballots. But what was very interesting is that the optical scan tapes themselves, when we finally obtained them, 57 of them, which is roughly 1/3 of them, contained anomalies, such as the numbers didn't match, or they didn't have signatures on them, or there were other kinds of discrepancies, or they were missing altogether. Interestingly, when we also requested the problem slips, the things that said everything that's gone wrong, we found a letter from Diebold asking Volusia County what they were doing with their memory cards because they had such a large amount of memory cards supposedly go bad. In other words, they needed extras. The number of memory cards they needed extras for happened to be 57. So we had 57 extra memory cards and 57 poll tapes with anomalies. These poll tapes traced back to a central warehouse, or a central drop-off point. And what happened is this was primarily African-American districts of Volusia County. And in these districts, instead of sending in the results directly to the elections office, they were instructed to take their memory card and their results and drop them off at the Daytona Speedway at this little facility that is run by law enforcement there. And they were supposed to put everything in an envelope, drive through, drop it off. We know this because I then went to interview the poll workers who worked in these districts. We videotaped that also. When I interviewed the poll workers, and this is something that really does not constitute evidence, but it's interesting to note. Several of them looked at the poll tapes that I showed them and said, that is not what I signed. The numbers were different. And they tried to remember what the numbers were, but you really have to discount that at that point and say, well, something doesn't smell right, but that's all we can do. Volusia County's chain of custody on their ballots themselves was so badly damaged that a hand count of the ballots we considered to be meaningless, because another thing we found in the Volusia County warehouse trash was homemade ballots. The person who had 24-hour access to the ballot vault and the key was also at the warehouse that day. So if you can be in there replacing ballots, hand counts aren't going to tell you anything. So we were stuck for a while. We just knew something was wrong in Volusia County. We then went to Palm Beach County, which has the Sequoia voting system. They refused to give us the records. We had to sue them for them. We finally got the records about a month ago, and we now know why they didn't want us to see them. They were counting some of the poll tapes for the touchscreens in Palm Beach County. The votes were counted on October 19th. I don't know what the reason is for that, but I do know that it's illegal. The audit of Palm Beach County is crashing and burning, as did some of their voting machines, quite literally. In the Sequoia system, and I want you to picture this with 80-year-old poll workers, it says in the manual, if you put the battery in wrong, the machine may explode. They did have machines that caught fire on election day during the voting. But when you ask them if anything went wrong, they say everything was perfect. I asked them for trouble slips. There were none. And Teresa Lepore, who was the election supervisor at the time, is now the elections fraud investigator for Palm Beach County. So any information we come up with, if we turn it over to Palm Beach County authorities, goes right back to her. But let's go back to Diebold, because this is where we really get to harder evidence. We noticed that when we went to Brevard County, Florida, which also had a 4,000 vote anomaly attributed to the central tabulator in the 2000 election, they hid their records, refused to give them to us at all. To this day, we have not gotten them, and we will have to sue them in order to get them. Duval County, Florida, also had major anomalies in the 2000 election. At that time, they had punch cards. In the 2004 election, they have Diebold optical scan system, and they've refused to give up the records. We got really interested in what's going on with Diebold optical scan systems, because Diebold optical scan systems are used to count about 35 million votes in the United States. That's 35% of the presidential election. They're used in 800 jurisdictions in 30 states. So this was a systemic issue that we wanted to find out what it is that would cause people not to want us to see their poll tapes. What do they mean by a memory card problem? We brought in an expert from Finland. And, well, let me mention one thing before we get to the expert. We also went to a small county called Glades, Florida. This is typical of the rural counties in America, and there are many. They also use Diebold optical scan. The Diebold rep runs their election because the election supervisor does not know how to run her voting system. She did not know his last name. She did not know the password to her own system. It turns out the Diebold representative was a temporary worker hired on a contractual basis. This represents a this computerized voting represents a fundamental way of change of how we run elections, because we've always used certified and sworn election officials, not somebody whose last name we don't know, who works for a vendor on secret software. I brought in actually two experts. One expert, Dr. Herbert Thompson, the time he can offer is very constrained, but he focused on the central tabulator, which is the main machine that pulls in all the votes. And I brought in Harri Hursti, who is a computer expert from Finland. There are wonderful officials in the state of Florida, believe it or not. I would say the best election official in the United States right now is a man by the name of Ian Sancho. He's the election supervisor for Leon County, Florida, Tallahassee. He's in the belly of the beast, and he has been doing battle single-handedly with people who want to push unauditable touchscreen voting into the state of Florida, and he's been doing this for quite a while. He wanted to see if his system was actually as secure as the vendor and the state certifiers assured him it was. So he allowed us to come in with our experts and test a real system in a real environment and see if we could penetrate it. When Dr. Herbert Thompson sat down at the central tabulator in Leon County, Florida, on February 14th, it took him 90 seconds to penetrate the system. He did not need a password. And the exploit that he used is such that they would have to rewrite the entire system because he uses an exploit in Windows itself, which they use as the operating system. He implanted a Trojan horse-like script which changed the vote totals to do anything he wanted. We came back on May 2nd. We did 2 experiments. Dr. Thompson did a more sophisticated script. He's also written a JavaScript exploit for the central tabulator. This time, they had not told us they were going to remove some of the things on there and make it more secure before we got there. So they made the system more secure. They removed some stuff that they noticed he'd used. And this time it took him only 60 seconds to get in. We also evaluated remote access at this time. These results were interesting. We found that the Diebold touchscreen system uses a highly vulnerable remote access setup called RAS, Remote Access Server. The optical scan, however, uses a proprietary protocol, and while it is by no means impenetrable, you would have to use unauthorized means to gain entry. We chose not to use unauthorized means, but I think if somebody planned to manipulate election results, they might also use unauthorized means. We then decided to look at this memory card issue. The memory card issue is the subject of a security alert that will be published on Black Box Voting on the 4th of July. The reason I didn't bring it today is it actually is of such gravity that we have had to take it to some other steps, and we'll release those at the same time on 4th of July. But it is making its way through the rounds. I have a draft copy with me. I'm going to just read you the executive summary, which is the light reading portion of it. And this has by now been peer-reviewed, by the way, by, in a small way, by one other very high-level computer expert. This pertains to the Diebold Optical Scan 1.94W series, although we have seen no evidence that it doesn't apply to all the optical scan series, including the newer ones. And in fact, the release notes of the newer systems actually appear to offer more remote access ability than the old ones. The findings of this study indicate that the architecture of the Diebold precinct-based optical scan 1.94 voting system inherently support the alteration of basic functionality. Thus, the alteration of the produced results every time an election is prepared. The fundamental design of the Diebold precinct-based optical scan includes the optical scan machine, which has the firmware, and the removable media, the memory card, which should contain only the ballot box, but also contains a living thing. An executable program which acts on the vote data. Changing this executable program on the memory card changes the way the votes are reported. Whereas we would expect to see vote data in a passive environment, this system places the vote into an active environment. With this architecture, every time an election is conducted, it is possible to introduce program functions, either authorized or unauthorized, wholesale or targeted, and there is no way to verify that the certified or even the standard functionality is maintained from one voting machine to the next. While recognizing that no security system is capable of defeating all conceivable or theoretical threats, even 15 years ago when the 1990 Federal Election Commission standards were enacted, vendors and election authorities were expected to, quote, do everything that prudence dictates and that the available resources permit to institute a security program. The standards, which were used to certify the system in Leon County, required vendors to obtain an acceptable level of confidence in the integrity, reliability, and inviolability of the entire election process, including protecting the system from intentional fraudulent manipulation, from malicious mischief, and being able to identify fraudulent changes to the system. And it goes on to specify the use of checksums and parity. However, within the context of expected security responsibilities, one layer of security should be preventive cost factors. While the system will always be breakable, The feasibility of penetration should be inhibited by the cost of such an endeavor. It should cost you a whole lot of money if you're going to get into one of these systems, making it fewer people that can do it. What the author has identified, however, is a one-man exploit requiring only a few $100s, mediocre technical ability, and modest persuasive skills. In the author's opinion, which is Harry Hursty, by the way, in the author's opinion, the greatest problem in the system is its very design architecture itself. Incorporated into the foundation of the Diebold optical scan is the mother of security holes. No apparent cure will produce infertility or system safety. The design would not be appropriately characterized as a house with a door open. The design of the Diebold optical scan system is, in the author's view, more akin to a house with an unlockable revolving door. Now, what he did, let me give you a little bit of background on how he went about testing this. And let's see. I don't think I have that page with me. Essentially what we did is we worked together with a gentleman from Great Britain and from the Leon County Elections Supervisor to set up 3 separate testing situations. And in each testing situation, we tested a different thing. Shortly before the third one, when we did the memory card optical scan exploit, Harry Hursty came to Renton, Washington, which is where our office is, and he simply looked at the documentation. He didn't even look at the system. This is not something he had examined before. He didn't have access to a memory card. He simply looked at publicly available information on the system, and within 24 hours, he says, we have the Holy Grail. What we have is a system that is designed for flexibility. It has chosen flexibility over security. And in the context of elections, flexibility means the ability to change the way the system acts upon the votes. So we were able then to obtain memory cards, or the little ballot boxes, from Leon County. Now, they have 2 kinds of systems. They have new memory cards, which are called PCM-CIA cards, but a lot of the older systems, thousands of them in the United States, use an older memory card, which is an Epson 40-pin compatible thing that's obsolete now, but Diebold has purchased sort of a whole huge amount of them, and they keep using them. So the problem with this is you couldn't stick it into a computer and actually read what was on the memory card. But not to worry, we found a particular device that is used to scan corn while it grows. It's called a crop scanner, which also reads these memory cards. Cost a few $100s, bought it off the internet, and we were in like Flint. Harry then took the memory cards from Leon County, stuck them in the crop scanner, took a dump from that and put it onto his his laptop. Didn't need to reverse engineer or even read the Diebold program. He simply wrote his own, made it up, stuck it on, deleted the Diebold program for the most part, stuck his own program in place of it, and went down to Leon County, and lo and behold, the results changed, but you couldn't tell. It looked identical. In fact, the election supervisor said, I can't tell if these are the real results. I need to get the old results. And Harry said, look at the bottom of the tape. And at the bottom of the poll tape, he had programmed the machine to print out a message that said, is it real or is it Memorex? He did 3 separate exploits, rigged the election 3 separate ways in less than 5 minutes by simply writing his own programs onto memory cards and sticking them in the machine. To make this a little bit scarier, you don't have to go through the procedure of actually putting each card in the machine. You can actually change it globally by simply replacing a single file in the Windows directory. It's actually in the Windows program file directory under GEMS. They have a series of programs in there under a directory called AccuBasic. And they all end in the ABO ending. This is a non-standard programming language that Diebold made up, which is also a violation of FEC standards. And all you have to do if you want to globally change what's written onto the memory cards and put your own stuff on there is change, or just simply replace one of those files. You replace one ABO file with your own ABO file, and when they go to create the memory cards in the first place, which actually comes from the central tabulator, it comes from the mothership, when they first put those cards on the machine, the damage is done. You can also set it up so that one memory card, one ballot box, in a hidden way, actually overwrites the data of all the other ballot boxes or any of the ones that you particularly choose at once. It is so flexible, you can literally do anything you want. Another thing that he demonstrated in Leon County, and of course we have this on video and we also have copies of the false poll tapes that were produced. But another thing he demonstrated was he took control of the buttons in the optical scan machine that tell it yes, no, and how to turn off the election, start it, close it down. He also took control of the LCD panel. When the IT guy he actually thought that the demonstration was over, and he was running some poll tapes from the machine to make sure it was okay. And up on the LCD screen pops a message, "Are we having fun yet?" And he literally jumped and he turned off the machine. He's and Hari said, "Well, don't worry, that was mine. Don't worry, I put that in there." But when you think about it, maybe we should worry. If someone can put it in under the nose of an IT professional who knew you were in there to do an exploit, but didn't even see that suddenly you had not only taken over the results from the optical scan, but had taken over the buttons and the LCD screen itself. What's dangerous about that is you can have the screen flash and say, "The election has been closed, no more ballots can be run." It just tells you that, and it can be running more ballots. The number of exploits with this fundamental design is staggering. When I hear people testify and say, "We're going to look for that same pattern next time," I got to smile because there's no reason in the world to use the same pattern next time. It took Hari, and this is when he didn't really even know the system very well, but 45 minutes, he had written a whole new program. One of his programs changed the votes. Another program did something scary. He determined that because they use a 2-digit integer, I've got the technical stuff here, but I won't go into it for the sake of the crowd or myself because you might ask me a question. But essentially what happens with the Diebold system is it rolls over the odometer. In other words, if you have a car and you get to 99,999 miles, when it hits 100,000, it rolls it over to 0. Well, the Diebold system rolls over to 0 at 65,000. You guys, computer guys, will know it's in the 65,000 number in there. At any rate, what you do then is you preload the ballot box, which we tested, and it worked. You preload the ballot box with just maybe 40 less, 25 less than that 65,000 number, knowing that it will roll over and turn to 0 and then start counting from 0 again. At the same time, you take that same amount of votes and add them to the candidate you want. So let's say you take 25 less than 65,000 for John Kerry, and you put 25 more for George Bush, and you preload it so it's stuffed before you ever begin election day. Then you simply replace the 0 report portion of the program with your own, which says no matter what's in the machine, call it a 0. We tested it, this is no problem. And then when the ballots are run, the candidates start out with an artificial 50-vote spread between them. And it's going to be completely impossible to find this thing unless you actually hand count all the paper ballots. What this exploit does is it destroys the entire paper trail when you combine it with Dr. Herbert Thompson's hack of the central tabulator. It takes a central tabulator report, compares it with the poll tapes coming out of the voting machines. Both are false, they match. And unless you do 100% hand count of those ballots, you're never going to know. Now, the exploit that I just mentioned there, where you roll over the odometer, that one, you don't even have to manipulate the central tabulator because you've contaminated the information at the source. So it sounds, when I've described this exploit to even computer scientists, it takes a while for the wheels to turn for some people. and to realize how dangerous this is. But essentially it means that someone with a modest amount of skill can take something the size of a credit card, swap it, or swap a file on a Windows tabulator, or gain remote access and do this, and the whole paper trail is blown. So I do want you to, for those of you who are technology inclined, to get the technical report that will be published on July 4th. It's a doozy, and the next logical question has to be, who knew this, and when did they know it? And I'll just very briefly speak to that. When Diebold acquired Global Election Systems in 2002, an interesting thing happened. They offered about $5 million, and then they suddenly discounted it by 25%, and then they discounted it again by another 25%, and then they discounted it by 50%, meaning that they got the company for free. Now, what would happen over that 6-week period to cause them to keep discounting it? What typically happens is something called due diligence, where you send in a software team to evaluate the software. I think it is time that we ask the question under oath of Diebold, when did you know of this problem? Did you sell your systems to the public knowing they had this flaw? When did you inform your customers that you had this problem? Because you see, what they're doing now is redesigning and planning to resell a new system. So the taxpayers, instead of doing what needs to be done, which is a product recall at the manufacturer's expense for selling a flawed product, instead, they're saying, you need our new and improved version. That'll be another several $1 million. Alameda County yesterday had a meeting on just that. I sued Diebold, me and a board member of ours, Jim March, on behalf of Alameda County. We sued them for making false claims. They ended up paying $2.6 million for the false claims they made. Therefore, Alameda County is now looking at a new system. Inexplicably, they're looking at investing another $6 million in an upgraded Diebold system. My contention is we need to know what Diebold knew, and we need to know when. The next question that comes out of this study is we need to know what the certifiers knew and when. Because Ian Sancho, the election supervisor in Leon County, was very disturbed about this information, and he went to Paul Kraft, who is the voting systems head of the state of Florida. And Paul Kraft, according to Ian, admitted that he knew of the problem but told no one. We need to know what the certifiers knew and when, and what the company knew and when, because what we found is a system that is completely non-compliant with common sense, but also with the federal election standards which we use to certify it. And we need to get an understanding of that before we know the root cause of this. And that's all I have to say on this, other than that we're not done with the other manufacturers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, I have your mic, huh?
That's okay. And so the U.S. electorate only 35% of the U.S. electorate uses Diebold hardware and software?
I think about 40%.
40%?
Some of it uses touchscreens that we have not confirmed or denied, but we haven't confirmed this problem in the touchscreen. We have done two things in California. Jim March and I have formally requested under a California statute that California examine the memory cards for all Diebold voting systems, including touchscreens. I would put the figure at 40%. Mississippi just went Diebold, I believe, just yesterday. So did Utah very recently. It's sort of a fluid number because a lot of people are buying right now. But of the market, the lion's share is still, I believe, ES&S. And I'm sorry to diverge, but this is interesting when you get to asking who knew what and when. We were able to trace in the Diebold software when this architecture appeared. Interestingly, it appeared at about the time that Bob Yarosevich came from Omaha to take over the company. Bob Yarosevich came from ES&S. His brother is still an executive at ES&S, and the two brothers founded ES&S together. So for that reason, Jim March and I have formally requested the Secretary of State of California to examine the memory card architecture for ES&S as well, under the theory that it may have a common ancestry.
Ms. Harris, is ARI the computer scientist that you had from Finland.
Harry Hursti, yes.
Yes. Is he available for testimony for taking an affidavit from?
He is flying back. A good question. We keep bringing him back as often as we can. He owns about 5 companies, and he has to go back and forth and actually run his business. So he's not available right at this time. He did testify in California, and he is the author of this report, and the report is, as I mentioned, peer-reviewed by the individual who's doing the peer review is, I can't pronounce his name, Kalle Kaukonen. He was one of the inventors of SSH.
This is the report you mentioned is coming out July
Correct.
4th. Okay, thank you. Other questions?
Yes. You formerly had come out and were in very strong support of the Open Voting Consortium, and I'd like to know what is your current, does this new...
Oh, very good, very good. In fact, I've been, the jury's been out with me on Open Voting Consortium, but one of our board members, Jim March, has been very supportive. So when we were in California last week, together with Harry Hursti, we had a meeting with the Open Voting Consortium and deemed it not ready for prime time. It appears to be a business plan whereby public funding will support the development and the royalties will go into private pockets. And there are significant concerns with the licensing agreement such that the open source may not really be so very open source. And there are significant problems with the architecture. They are looking at putting it, according to Arthur Keller, into the hardware made by ES&S and other manufacturers, instead of actually creating their own hardware. And as Hari said, if you put your software in my hardware, I own you.
Can you explain that?
Hardware can be manipulated also in the way that it interacts with the software. Hardware meaning, you know, the drivers that control the screen, that control the buttons, the firmware. And so if you have software, even if it's honest software, and you sell it to someone who may not be so honest, who has proprietary hardware, they can actually use the hardware to manipulate how the software works.
I understand.
So is black box voting's current recommendation to completely avoid optical scan? Do you have a recommendation?
Yes, we will be coming out with some specific recommendations during the month of July, but and it's taken me a while to come here, I mean, honestly, but I believe at this point the safest way to go, I know it's hard, we're going to go through a lot of pain getting there, folks, but we're going to have to go with hand-counted paper ballots at the precinct. Now remember, at the precinct is very important.
Please, order.
Because if it is true that paper ballots are often a target for fraud. However, the most appealing targets are the transportation from the precinct into the central count and the central count location itself. And let me just mention one more thing. We remember San Francisco had paper ballot fraud. They know they had it because they found ballot box lids, bright red ones, floating in the bay. But at least we could see the ballot box lids floating in the bay. With this stuff, we'll never see it.
I have a follow-up question. My own Board of Elections director has firmly stated we will be getting new machines. We will not be getting hand-counted paper ballots. And she is open to possibly citizens influencing the type of machine, but if we do not take a stand for some machine, we're going to get probably paperless DREs.
Yes, there's a simple solution for that. She's got to be replaced. This is not an area where we can compromise. You know, when you go and people are saying, oh, la, 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 let's do open source, and you go meet them and they don't have any kind of architecture that makes any sense at all, at what point are we going to stop just trusting people and start taking our own intellect and saying, let me find out for myself? One of the most disturbing things in this is that black box voting is not large. We're run by 2 investigators who are both 53-year-old women with no computer background. Why did it take 2 53-year-old women to go get a guy from Finland to tell us this stuff? That, I think, is more illustrative of the problem we have in this country than anything else, because we have charged off to spend $4 billion on systems that no one really personally looked into to see if they made any sense.
Bev, can I ask you another question? And this kind of goes to part of the mission of today, centering around trying to provide results that might lend themselves well towards policy making. In my line of work in mediation, there's usually far more than one side to the story. Would you care to comment on anything that you would expect that your detractors or intellectual opponents might have to say about your positions and ideas? What would be some of the likely avenues of approach that people opposed to your viewpoint might take? Would you care to comment
Sure.
on that? Thank you.
Sure. Well, we know from the way that we have structured the technical report that if a scientist comes out and says the technical report is not valid, then they're actually making a career decision because it is pretty incontrovertible. But on the issue of paper ballots, actually there's a valid problem that we are going to have as one of our first things we're going to have to address. And that's going to be part of our upcoming solutions report. But that is that 95% of the countries who have democracies do hand count paper ballots, but they do not have the number of ballot questions that we have. And I am not going to, with the two 53-year-old women that run black box voting, prescribe for the United States how we address that problem, but it's a significant problem. One of the things that's missing from all discussion about this, it seems, and this is the dog and pony show at the Baker-Carter Commission is a good example of this, is the people themselves. We're not welcome in that. I think we have to get the people themselves involved in the discussion of the solution before we start prescribing. But too many questions on the ballot, that's the number one problem with paper ballot counting. Most of the other problems can be handled. With the technical stuff, I expect to hear, oh, we've moved on to a new system. Well, we'll believe that when we hear it because you have to actually completely redesign the system and throw it away. And it still doesn't address who knew what and when and how the certification system broke down. I would like to see as next steps, and this is very important, toward getting real evidence of fraud if there was any. I want the memory cards sequestered from the 2004 election. The law requires that they be kept for 22 months. And it's only going to take one memory card that was used improperly using these exploits. We'll be able to see it on the memory card. And I think if we can examine the memory cards, the next logical step is either there's stuff on them that shouldn't be there or not. That's a legitimate pursuit considering what we found here. And if there is stuff on them, I think that is going to build a public will that will support some of the next steps that have to happen.
Did you say that these memory cards have been requested to be sequestered or should be?
Should be. We're going to put the technical report out first with some, we're shoring up support among the scientific community just a tad over the next couple of days so that it doesn't come out and get a PR news release. When Dr. Thompson did his Visual Basic script at the National Press Club in September, Diebold's response, which was printed in the New York Times with no follow-up questions, was, "It's a magic show." I don't want that on this report. So on this report, we're coming out with a little bit more scientific oomph. And at that point, I think we'll be in a much stronger position to request memory cards.
In your report, will you be addressing some of the things that you see need to be done to the certification process?
Not in this report. It's short to the point. It deals with just the memory card exploits.
But obviously, this process is severely broken to allow this kind of technology.
Correct. Our expert, because he's a computer programmer, not a lawyer, did not feel qualified to, although he went through the FEC standards, and he said it violates this, and this. That's not part of the report, but it's another next step that's very important. We've got to show first, and this goes across the board actually, when it comes to procedures and when it comes to certification, we're not following the laws that are on the books. People who say we need to pass new laws don't understand that. When you're out in the field as much as I am, you see that we're not even following the law. And until we address compliance and put some consequence in for non-compliance, we're not going to improve it by adding new laws and new standards.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Eve.
My question is this, I'm from California, and we do have a special election coming up in November. If we are not able to, for instance, in the very near future, be assured that we will be free of Diebold and or other electronic voting machines, is not a paper ballot with the ability to, say, for instance, 3 to 5% hand count afterwards, worth something?
Not as much as you think. I wish, yes. Unfortunately, our investigator Kathleen Wynn observed the Ohio recount where they did a 3%, and that's where we have the tremendous non-compliance. It's not randomly chosen. It is secretly counted ahead of time, not just in the county where they put the cheat sheet on the wall, but she videotaped officials from Cuyahoga County, which is Cleveland. And when they brought out the 3% random count, they were in clusters, 80 for this candidate, 80 for that. And when they asked them why they were in clusters, they admitted that they had counted them in secret beforehand. We were lucky to get that admission. Because at least we know it's against the law. And when we then confronted the Cuyahoga Board of Elections about 3 weeks ago, they said, at the point, by the way, and when we did this, they were going, we've got to really go after voter fraud. We have 4 voters out of the million in Cuyahoga County that we think committed fraud, and we're going to get them for voting twice. So Kathleen stepped up and said, are you going to hold yourself to the same standards because you violated the law in the recount? And they said, well, violating a statute is not really a criminal act, and we always do it that way. So I guess the 5 or 3% or whatever, where that breaks down is that we just don't have any procedural compliance or any teeth in that. And it's just so frustrating. I know Connie McCormick from Los Angeles County on her random recount picked a precinct that had 3 voters. I mean, Los Angeles has 6 million voters. I know, I'm sure she picked other good ones, but what happens is you get a lot of game playing with the random count. But I will tell you this too, I'm not saying we have to have everything perfect by the very, very next election. I wish we would, but we've got to get everything right permanently. I'd rather do that than put Band-Aids on something and say, we're just temporarily going to fix it this way, and we know it's not perfect. Let's say, whatever the transition is, let's get it right in the long run.
I have another question in response to what you said earlier in regards to my other question, and that is, I'm from Pennsylvania. As you may know, we recently decertified the Unilike Patriot machines. 3 counties were forced, if you want to call it that, onto optical scan systems for our May primary this year. And one of the feedbacks that they got was that voters did not enjoy voting on the optical scan. They wanted the touchscreens, and they certainly didn't want the paper. So in addition to the Board of Election Directors, they're torn. They're not. It's not a matter of. Oh, yeah. So what my question is,
what was the source of that feedback? Because the vendors are pretty active in finding feedback like that and making press releases.
The source of that feedback was a citizens activist group who worked to get the machines decertified, and they were on the ground during election day and talked to voters.
And people said that they didn't like it.
They felt they were old-fashioned and backward. So my question.
Well, birthing babies is old-fashioned too. We don't have a computer do that.
Well, not yet. My question is this: if given the different things that can affect this issue, can you recommend anything else at this time other than hand-counted paper ballots or whatever comes down the pike that's handed to you otherwise?
No. I came to that in a very long and painful way, but it's a combination of, look, the reality of politics is all you got to do is mess with it and survive for 10 days and you're in. And there are, with a computerized system, too many, well, it's very simple actually. To simplify this way, you look at it as an attack tree. How many different ways are there to attack the system that are reasonably cost effective and don't require a million people who might tell on each other? And there are some attack vectors with hand-counted paper ballots at the precincts, but it's a relatively small amount of attack vectors, 4 or 5. With any computerized voting system, including open source, there's usually about 150 attack vectors, and every time you do a patch or an improvement or a bug fix, you usually add another one, so it's a constantly moving target. And when you add to that non-compliance and a strong incentive for fraud, you've got a pretty messy situation. So what you want to do is kind of simplify it and get something that's at least not a moving target and somewhat stationary.
I have a question. Okay, I'll save it.
Let's take about 5 minutes, and we'll reconvene for our next series of panelists. Thank you very much, Ms. Harris.
Thank you.
Thank you.